everyone, and welcome to the Kathy Reisenwitz Show. I am Kathy Reisenwitz, and today I am joined by Julie Mastrine. She is she wears a few hats, but she recently wrote a guest post for my blog, Sex and the State, about a new affirmative consent law. Julie, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. So tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
So right now I am working at a petition site called care2.com, and we're basically a platform where people can start petitions about any issues that matter to them, and I helped them to get media attention. So I kind of handle the PR and like prepping people for speaking to journalists and things like that. And I apologize if you can hear my Google chats going off. Those are my coworkers. But yeah, so I do a lot of media and PR stuff around activism, and I'm also a social media volunteer for Stop Street Harassment, which is a nonprofit that is exactly what it sounds like. It is dedicated to ending gender-based street harassment worldwide, and I've been doing that for almost 2 years now. So
okay,
I do wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, and you're also a part of the Association of Libertarian Feminists, as I understand it. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I just wrote a piece for the newsletter about midwifery and kind of how cronyism has kind of killed midwifery. And my twin sister made a really awesome infographic for it. So yeah, it's one of my favorite groups.
That's awesome. And what brought you to the association or to libertarian feminism generally?
Well, my very good friend and I, we always were talking about politics, and we kind of had a more, progressive worldview. I was definitely more of a liberal kind of, and then I started kind of thinking more about how individuals relate to the state, and kind of started coming around to more like anarchist thinking, and kind of learning about economics and what a voluntary system look like, and just talking about that with my friends and reading about it online, and that has all happened within the past like year and a half. Since then I've changed, and I've sort of come to understanding that a more libertarian society, or society built on voluntary actions and without the force of the state, be the best way to achieve freedom and even more equality for people worldwide. So it really meshes with my feminist worldview, and I think that feminism and libertarianism are really compatible ideologies.
Awesome. And how do you define feminism? Because a lot of people in the libertarian community are very, very ignorant about what feminism actually holds, and so what do you tell people that are unclear about what feminism really means?
Right. I try to sort of tackle it from the standpoint of it being anti-authoritarian, and also about it being based on like choice. So I sort of kind of explain it as a way of being a woman. I don't believe that men should hold, authority over me or my actions, or dictate, what I should or should not do in my life. So it's kind of this ideology of freedom, which I also think extends to the state. I think that if women really believe in freedom and self-ownership, and really want to be able to choose things like getting an abortion, or using birth control, or dressing how they want, and like all these things that are related to freedom, are that to me, that is what feminism is. And I know that feminism varies for a lot of people. Some people it means different things, which is really important to remember. Anytime that you're engaging in feminist circles, you're always going to encounter people who have different ideas than you. But to me, it really is an anti-authoritarian ideology, and really one that's focused on choice, which is, and I think that extends to the state, which is why I think it's very compatible with libertarianism.
And where do you think that feminism kind of adds to libertarianism, in that libertarianism is itself an anti-authoritarian worldview? So, why do we need a separate ideology or, framework in feminism?
Right. So I also kind of try to explain it to people as, feminism is a lens, and it's largely historical. When we look at, the history of the planet, men have held the majority of seemingly the dawn of time. Even I think worldwide today, only women own just 1% of property, which is honestly just really the only statistic that you need to hear to realize that the cards are largely stacked against women. It's also a cultural thing. Feminism is a lot about examining the ideologies that we see in society or attitudes. A lot of it is how they view femininity as weaker, and masculinity as more aggressive, when really it's more of a spectrum, and things are much more nuanced than the black and white gender dichotomy that we're fed really from birth. And I think that's really important, and that really informs how we look at individuals and how we relate to one another. And so feminism to me is necessary because we kind of live in this framework where men hold the majority of power and resources. I mean, you can look at our legislative bodies and see that they're male-dominated, or you can look at a very micro level and people often joke about rape or something like that, and it really just encompasses all of these things. So that's why feminism is necessary to me. Just kind of providing a framework for us to see how our current paradigm affects women in negative ways.
So a lot of men's rights activists will say, okay, sure, the vast majority of CEOs and people in political power are male, but so are the vast majority of people in prison, and so are the vast majority of people in jobs that threaten their lives and are very unpleasant to do. So they see it less as men having power and more men being concentrated on the both ends of the power spectrum. How would you address that conception?
Yeah, I sort of think that that those types of issues that people point out are feminist issues, because the fact that more men are in prison, or men are more likely to be in war, or any sort of thing like that, is a real symptom of patriarchal power, which holds these ideas that men are supposed to be aggressive, or they're supposed to be the breadwinner. If you want to talk about men not being awarded child custody, divorce proceedings, all of these negative things that affect men are feminist issues. And I find it regretful that a lot of feminists don't focus on those issues so much, which is why we've seen some backlash with like the men's rights movement and things like that. But I think what's really important to drive home is that our current paradigm in which women are seen as lesser than and weak and things like that really negatively affect men, because it does push them into these dangerous occupations and wars and things like that. So I don't think that it nullifies the need for feminism at all.
No, I think that's really well articulated. Gender roles are pernicious, and you see it in the way that women are expected to take on the majority of childcare, even in the case of divorce, and you see it in the way that men are expected to provide, even when they don't have a good education, or they maybe aren't particularly well suited to high-wage jobs. And I think you're right, and it's really sad to me because. I also use the lens analogy for, yes, libertarianism should be sufficient in and of itself to combat authority, because that's what it is at its heart, is anti-authoritarian. At the same time, the focus has been on a certain subset of issues which primarily affect wealthy, well-educated, not particularly religious, intelligent white men with property. So though it is sufficient in theory, in practice, it's pretty narrow. And so feminism helps illuminate those neglected areas of authoritarianism and shines a light on this particular form of oppression. I think similarly, what could happen with feminism and libertarianism and libertarian feminism is that feminism could help make libertarianism better by shining that light and by highlighting those problems. But instead what you see is libertarians treating feminism with a lot of hostility. And similarly with the MRA movement, again, feminism should be in and of itself enough to address all MRA issues because it is at its core an anti-sexist movement. And if not every single issue that the MRA community brings up, legitimate issue, the vast majority of them do directly result from sexism. But the problem is that, again, feminism has focused its efforts on a very narrow set of problems, primarily that of property-owning, well-educated, not particularly religious white women. And so, and the sad thing about the MRAs is that instead of being anti-sexist, they're explicitly anti-feminist. And so you've got this fighting each other that's completely anti-everyone's goals and really, really stupid. Just like you have the libertarians fighting the feminists, it just doesn't make any sense, and it's really unfortunate. But I digress. Let's get to that article you wrote because I thought it was a good articulation of, again, kind of the idea that underpins libertarianism and our brand of feminism, consent. Can you kind of sum up the law that you were addressing?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a bill in California, Senate Bill 967, and it would basically mandate that colleges and universities receiving state funds abide by a definition of affirmative consent for evaluating sexual assault and rape in the campus justice system. And obviously I use justice system loosely because often we don't see any justice in these cases. The bill was definitely more problematic when it was first written. And I can get to that in a little bit. But as it stands right now, it has a definition of affirmative consent that is a little bit less harmful than the original version, but it still, I think, is important for us to kind of question the state's role in enshrining these definitions in law and what kind of like unintended negative consequences it could have. I was really intrigued by this piece of legislation because I've been an advocate of affirmative consent for a really long time, and I think it's really important, especially for teaching young people who are just kind of navigating the waters of sexual activity, and especially at the collegiate level where people are more likely to hook up with someone they've just met at a frat party or a bar, and a lot of these students are coming from the public education system where they may have been, taught comprehensive sex ed, but that often doesn't encompass, it kind of encompasses how to avoid STDs and how to use condoms, and doesn't really make sure that you know how to ensure that sexual activity is voluntary for both parties. But seeing consent enshrined in law like it is in this bill seems kind of counterintuitive to me, and I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. As I say in my guest post, enshrining the definition of affirmative consent in law and making that colleges abide by it would potentially provide a framework for rapists, but it could also have, very unintended consequences, even if it is well-intentioned. It could make criminals out of those who are not, and sexual assault and rape cases will likely still come down to a he said, she said kind of thing. I don't think it will change the culture that's at the root of sexual assault. So yes, affirmative consent should be the societal standard, but I'm not convinced that it's enforceable or even useful in a legal context. Legislation itself is often a band-aid for cultural problems, and it really isn't the best use of our time when it comes to changing a problem at its roots. I often see feminists asking for government to fix problems using force, and I myself used to advocate for government intervention to fix a lot of, problems that I see as feminist issues. But using government force to end rape culture is exactly counterintuitive. It's worth noting that a lot of the initial outrage directed at this bill was because an early version of it was absolutely ridiculous. There was specific language in the bill that could have been great for maybe an educational program, but really problematic as law. For instance, it required that consent be unambiguous. It specifically said, quote, people must obtain, quote, a freely and affirmatively communicated willingness to participate in particular sexual activity or behavior expressed either by words or clear, unambiguous So it pretty specifically mandated verbal consent, which is very hairy if we're going to be putting that in law. I mean, and unambiguous actions, anything in the realm of human language and communication can be construed as ambiguous. It said, the early version of the bill noted that, quote, relying solely on nonverbal communication can lead to misunderstanding. And this is true. But for the purposes of law, we have to remember that intimacy is a very intricate thing. Plenty of people have voluntary sex using nonverbal cues that indicate it's consensual. You know, by mandating verbal consent for sex in law, it would make criminals out of even myself and my boyfriend, you know, and a lot of consenting couples. It's just kind of the government sort of micromanaging the private sphere in a way that's really ineffective and really unenforceable and not very helpful. Another part of the bill that's pretty murky, that's been getting a lot of, you know, pushback, is that it says that, quote, consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual encounter. And again, this is also true. On a cultural level, but you know, it's important for people to know that having this written in law is where it gets really shaky, because particularly when it comes to how sex actually plays out in real life, having sex involves a gradual escalation of activity. So this language kind of implies that if you don't specifically greenlight every step of the way, you've committed a crime. And that's just ridiculous, you know. So when evaluating this type of legislation, we need to be really careful not to make a mockery of consent. Feminists like myself have, you know, tried really, really hard to drive home the importance of consent. But legislation like this, particularly if it were to be implemented on a state or national level, could really be harmful and kind of make a mockery of personal responsibility, which is really at the core of consent in these intimate situations. And that's really what we're trying to drive home with the concept of consent, is that it's really, you know, the onus is on the individuals, and we're not going to end rape culture with top-down legislation. It really has to start from the bottom up and from education. Absolutely. One thing that is worth mentioning is a similar policy at Antioch College in 1991. It actually required that consent be verbal, mutual, and repeated for every form of sexual behavior, and it was heavily ridiculed in the media, and even became the butt of an SNL skit, just because mandating these things in code or law just really doesn't make sense practically, like in our lives, in our personal lives.
That's a great point. Thank you so much for summing that up. Julie, where can people find you other than the ALF newsletter?
On Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, or my website, juliamastrini.com. And my Twitter handle is also just Julie Mastrini. I love getting new followers and talking to people about liberty on Twitter, so absolutely follow me.
Yes, that's how I found out about her. She's great on Twitter. Thank you so much, Julie, for coming on. I will put the spelling of your Twitter and your website in the description. And thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos. It's Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Please like, comment, rate, subscribe, all that. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.